Imagine just how hard it would be if you lost one of your senses. So imagine if you can't smell the popcorn while watching your movie. Or maybe you couldn't taste what you're eating. Or syempre nandyan din yung why do we yearn for physical meetups even if we have virtual ones? Is it because of the sense of touch? The sense of seeing a person in three dimensions? Or not being bound to looking at the camera? Well, regardless of these, especially in eating, no, eating is a very complex thing, like all of our other activities. We require all our senses, no? Yung chicharon na walang crunch, iba yung dating. Kapag hindi mo nakikita yung visual texture ng isang pagkain, well, it doesn't feel the same na kumain ka ng nakapikit. Parang bawas yung joy na nararamdaman mo sa pagkain. That's why we need our senses. So the classic definition of sensory evaluation as a discipline is to evoke, measure, analyze, and interpret responses to, in this case, food products that are perceived by the senses of sight, smell, touch, taste, and hearing. Take note that sensory evaluation is not limited to food. No? Pwede actually silang gamitin sa things like cosmetics, even car seats. No? The feel ng kutsyon na inuupuan mo. There are professionals for those kinds of things, but nonetheless, we limit ourselves to food, so we'll have to discuss each one of these. We have a whole module on the senses, so let's start with the aspects, no, to evoke, measure, analyze, and interpret. So bago tayo magpatuloy, malamang ang iba sa inyo may expectation that since it's sensory evaluation at the end of this SEM ay magiging mga something like wine connoisseurs kayo na that you can taste something and then boom, alam ko na kung anong taon ginawa ito, aged in this kind of wooden barrel for 1.5 centuries, blah blah blah. So hindi po. Since we are using a scientific approach, then we more likely, if we do get to taste wine, do it using some sort of quantification methods and methodologies that have been proven throughout the years rather than becoming this lone expert that can identify 30 different tastes and flavors with just a single touch of our tongue onto the surface of our food. So, walang ganon, Mars. So I always tell my students, no, pag sinabing sensory evaluation, just remember the four letters E-M-A-N-I, M-I. It doesn't really spell anything useful, pero that's the order to it, no. So we start with evoking or how to get a desired response. So say you want to develop a product and you want to know how the consumers would feel about it. So paano mo palalabasin yun? You design a test, you choose the right population. Let's say kung pambata siyang product, then you choose children. You make the appropriate questionnaires. Ano ba yung level of understanding ng children? Would they, if they can't read and write properly, can they understand smiley faces to indicate their level of liking? And so on. How do you ask the question? What simple words do you use? And so on. Measurement has to deal with how we um, quantify or how we collect our qualitative responses. No? So, hindi kasi lahat ng bagay na dadaan sa numbers or kaya mong i-translate into numbers. No? Liking can be from a scale of, let's say, 1 to 9. But there are times wherein you have to get their comments on a product using, well, sentences and then try to make sense of those individual comments. Okay, but nonetheless, you need a way to measure them. So yes, that involves the questionnaire and how the questionnaire picks up answers. Next is analysis. So now that you have your numbers or your answers, you have to make sense of them. So for numerical responses, this is usually through the use of statistical analysis, na significant differences. You can have mean, median, mode, measures of central tendency when applicable, looking at standard deviations for some, or organizing the rank sums, and so on. For qualitative responses, this would be thematic building up of answers. Di ba halimbawa, nag-survey kayo ng 100 people, their comments are worded differently, but you can, let's say, categorize their answers into five different sorts of things like merong complaint on the texture of the product, kumbaga mouthfeel. Others are saying um, yung visual appeal niya may problema sa uniformity ng color and so on. So you try to divide those responses. And then lastly, you have interpretation or how you arrive at your conclusion. So that depends on the first three. Kung maganda yung pagkatanong mo at nakuha mo yung dapat mong matanong, and then you were able to use the necessary measuring or quantification or qualitative tools. Then you make the analysis. You can now make an interpretation. What does this mean? Does this mean that my product will be liked in the market? Does this mean that there is an observable difference between my two products which are supposed to be the same? So, maraming kayang saguting tanong ang sensory evaluation. So, just like food science, sensory evaluation did not pop out overnight. It's the product of multidisciplinary approaches, mostly evolving from psychology, na nag-evolve over a span of, well, almost 2 centuries in this case. So let's look at how it started and where it is now. So one of the more popular fields in sensory evaluation or subtopics is discrimination studies, or being able to tell differences between things. Think of it as yung mga being able to find 12 differences in the two pictures or something like that. Okay, so Weber, a physiologist, started this concept and developed yung tinatawag natin ngayon na just noticeable difference. And then, decades after, Fechner developed the use of scales of subjective magnitudes, probably a prelude to our ordinal scales that we use now. And then the early 1900s, they developed a sensory scale for measuring the errors of response or the law of comparative judgment. And then 5 years later, they started using statistics in experimental design. So in this part of history, ito yung pinaka-groundwork sa psychological aspect, no? Kasi they were trying to quantify responses. Na this human response, can we put a number to it, or can we statistically analyze this one such that if we have enough responses, we can deduce the from the population itong response ng sample. Then a decade later, we have the development of various tests such as the paired comparison, rating scales, and rank order. So these are also things that we'll study, especially in the lab with our exercises. And this will show us the different methods of comparing two or more, in this case, food products. Then the 1940s, Bernard Amering developed methodologies for wine evaluation. So as you know, pag sinabing sensory evaluation, nandyan parati sa top of mind yung wine. Because as a field na marami siyang connoisseurs, and they would want a way of making their data reproducible. Then there was a development of the triangle test, which is a difference test we can use for a lot of purposes. No? Something like if you want to know if the bread baked yesterday has a noticeable difference from the bread that has been baked today, you can use that test. And then acceptance tests, which are usually used for consumer studies, ay na-develop for the Army ng US, no, yung pagkain nila. So, syempre alam naman natin kung sundalo ka, may edge ka kapag yung pagkain mo ay mas masarap kaysa sa iba because of military food has had a history of being pragmatic or functional na form over function. It will give you the right nutrients or allow you to survive, but it's not necessarily the happiest food to eat. Okay, and then AD Little in 2050 developed the precursor to the flavor profile, which is a very important system that we use now. We won't do it in the lab, but something similar doon ang aralin nyo sa descriptive sensory evaluation. And then one of the most popular or yung 1955 na published yung 9-point hedonic scale. So this is a scale of liking from 9 points nga siya. So meron kang dislike extremely to like extremely, and then in between neither like nor dislike. Um, One major thing about this is that in a 9-point hedonic scale, generally the data can be treated not just as ordinal but as interval data. Now, meaning to say you can apply a wide range of even parametric statistics on your numerical data and translate the data into something like a 0 to 100 scoring system, no? So, mas mas reliable siya in that case, and supposed to be yung psychological distance ng bawat point sa scale ay numerically equal. So in the 1960s, naging popular yung paggamit ng humans, not just as respondents, but rather as somewhat replacement to instruments. So parang ito na yung tinatawag nating trained panelists, no, that they can be trained so that they can replicate responses normal level of accuracy normally associated with machines. And this person whose surname I cannot quite pronounce because of so many consonants um, published the classification of textural dimensions, or yung tinatawag natin ngayon na texture profile analysis, no? And half a decade later, we now have Amerine publishing pioneering books on sensory evaluation, and the American Society of Testing Materials similarly publishing different standards on sensory evaluation. So, well, may bayad yung mga yan, kaya hindi natin basta-basta ma-access. And the system for qualitative descriptive analysis was also developed. And during the late 70s and early 80s, um, other methods were developed, the magnitude estimation, which is some sort of a visualization of the scale of difference in intensities of, let's say, sweetness, parang ganon. And the use of computers gave way to the use of multivariate statistics, which is advanced processing power. Now, nowadays, when we do stat, sure, you can do calculator for basic ones. You can have Excel for slightly more advanced. Pero yung mga ginagamit like sa population census wherein you have hundreds or thousands of data points, or even correlating complex things like multiple variables, you can use multivariate statistics with a click of a button kasi normally hindi na ito kaya ng calculator at tao lang. And then line marking time intensity scales were also developed in this case, in this era rather. So when you have time intensity, it's something like you measure the intensity increase or decrease of something over time. Like let's say residual na anghang sa bibig mo, or kung meron parang after effects na sinubo mo ngayon, tas mamaya mo lang mararamdaman yung tamis niya or what. Okay. And then the spectrum method, which is related to descriptive analysis, was also introduced. Later on, so may predictive modeling na nakasama, you can now actually, using the data collected, write equations for maybe predicting behavioral patterns and the like. And then because of the rise of the internet, it's now possible to do consumer testing online, especially kung visual or auditory yung mga tinetest mo, like how do you like the sound or yung color ng food na pinesent mo in pictures lang or audio clips. And then from 2003, there was a wide usage of preference mapping, which is of course related to marketing. How do you present in a two-dimensional space yung preferences ng mga tao? Of course, not all of these things we discussed ay kaya nating tutukan sa lecture, but we will at least in passing describe them later on. So, nasabi ko kanina na napaka-useful ng sensory evaluation. And probably kayo sa stay nyo sa UP ay malamang na-invite na kayong mag-sensory ng inyong mga upperclassmen na food tech or nutrition students. Pero lalo na pag nag-graduate tayo sa trabaho natin, sa research or thesis, ano ba ang use nito? So, for quality control, no, you can compare, let's say, two batches of production samples. Actually, yung triangle test, ginagamit yun sa beer, no? Na how do you know if this beer is exactly like the previous batch? Shelf life studies, how do you know when a product is at the end of its shelf life? The simple answer is when they are no longer the same. So tulad nga ng sabi ko kanina, halimbawa ang pandesal ay problem sa kanya is staling. If to know whether or not a pandesal is already stale, so you produce a new batch and compare the older batch until based on the numbers, their panelist responses ay parang noticeable na magkaiba yung texture nila. There are many uses in product development. So, pwede ka yung prototypes ipatest mo no, sa estudyante or sa mga panelists. When I was working in Magnolia Ice Cream, my colleague was developing ice lollies, orange ice popsicles. Went to a school to ask the students' perceptions about the products she was developing. So, nagdala siya ng products doon, may questionnaires and all that. Product matching is when you try to, let's say, may competitor ka, gusto mong gayahin yung product niya kasi yun yung mabenta, di ba? So, you try to compare those products blindly, hindi alam ng tao na si si brand number one at yung brand na gaya-gaya mo yung tinitikman nila tapos will they notice the difference or will it garner a similar consumer level of liking. Similarly for the formulation, usually what you want to do is either status quo, gusto ko magbawas ng ingredient cost, I'll replace this with a cheaper brand, yung ingredient ko, or I'll use less, but will they notice the difference? Or similarly, I want to claim that this product has been improved kasi sabi nila, maaligas-gas daw yung texture ng malt chocolate drink ko. So, I need statistically quantifiable responses to say that mas better nga itong bagong formulation. Mapping is when you want to, in a certain product space, locate where your product is. No? So like, if there's certain attributes associated with this product in the market, let's say, what kind of peanut butter ka ba? Are you the oily type, the dikit sa ngipin type, the sweet type, or the nutty type? So, meron niyang 2 or 3 dimensional space wherein you could figure out where to place your product in reference to others in the market or to consumer preference. And then lastly, of course, you have product acceptability, which is simply whether or not they will like my product or how much they will like this product para malaman ko kung ibebenta ko siya o hindi. Because apparently you have flops in the market sometimes because they they post products or they make products na hindi naman nila chinek kung magugustuhan ba talaga ng madlang people. But sensory evaluation, of course, is not just about the product. So, you can have behavioral or physiological studies in relation to product consumption. So, you can look at even the interaction with the packaging material. Is it easy to open? Does the instructions make sense? Can I cook this product properly pag sinunod ko ito? Or ano ba yung gripes nila sa product na ito? Ay, yung pag ina-unscrew ko yung metal cap niya, nasusugatan ako. So, stuff like that, pwede sa sensory yun, no? Measurement of emotions as affected by perception of various senses. how does the color of this packaging make me feel? How does this aroma, di ba? Like sinabi natin, langhap, sarap. Talaga namang kahit malungkot yung araw mo, pag bumili ka ng langhap, sarap burger or something, kahit papano, uy, may entice ka, yummy. Okay, anong kulay ba yung interior ng fast food para maengganyo kang bumili at kumain and so on. Wala ka naman nakikitang fast food restaurant na itim yung mga background for some reason or purple, di ba? It's always something like orange or red. And then taste genetics in relation to nutrition and product utilization. Um, Dr. Villarino had studies on super tasters sa Philippines or sa Asians. And I was a part of this study as a student, isa akong test subject. And in there, tinignan nila no, how sensitive are different ethnicities or different demographies like male versus female, age group, etc. Or status like alcohol drinker to non-alcohol drinker to certain taste perceptions na in this case yung super taster na tinatawag natin na determine to usually through their ability to detect bitter compounds. Kumbaga, more or less proven na kung ikaw yung madalas kang uminom ng alcohol, most likely hindi pa mapait sa'yo yung isang bagay na para sa isang super taster ay kasuklam-suklam or kasuka-suka yung pait, no? So, pwede rin yun, no? You can actually use sensory evaluation to also look at the physiological differences in human beings as reflected in their taste status or ability to taste things. Again, just a reminder na ang sensory, hindi lang po yan ginagamit sa pagkain. No? There are people na ang trabaho nila ay mangamoy ng kilikili ng may kilikili to test the effect of deodorants. And as I mentioned, no, some people are professional car seat raters para malaman yung comfort, especially if you're gonna mass produce something in the millions. You don't want to find out after na ayaw bilhin ng mga tao itong coaching ito dahil bulok yung upuan niya or something. After a long drive, masakit na sa katawan. So, yun, anything that can be sensed through any of the senses, pwede mong gamitan ng sensor evaluation, but for our purposes, we're limiting ourselves to food. So sabi nila ang sensory evaluation ay hindi siya purely science lang. May parang pagka-social science aspect siya. In the first place, they're using panelists, no? And you have to deal with them from selection um, up until the giving of incentives. So um, we have to consider that in a panelist selection, there are physiological and psychological differences. And that's why when you look at the population, um, you have to get a large enough sample size. And then there are also demographic characteristics na usually we collect the social demographics of our panelists na what is pag nakatanong ka na, nakasagot ka ng questionnaire, what is your age or age range, single ka ba, may asawa, anak, sinong bumibili ng pagkain sa household ninyo, ang daming tanong, pati household income. Bakit nila kailangan malaman yung income ko? Well, because of course, if you're developing a product, for example, they want to know, kanino ko ba ibebenta to? Ito ba ay pampalengke, pang yung hotdog. Ito ba yung hotdog na level na nabibili mo sa kalsada ng tagli 5 piso? Ito ba yung hotdog na pinapambaon sa anak mo? And so on. Ang bibili ba nito ay middle class, higher income ranges, and so on. No? And kaya mapapansin nyo, may hotdog na 100 pesos per kilo, may hotdog na nasa 350 pesos per kilo, and not the same type of people buy them not for daily or for regular use. And that's the result of research from sensory evaluation. Also, since you have human subjects as panelists, usually we need ethics approval for this. No? Although in class, usually medyo waived siya sa ngayon, pero habang naging mas strict tayo, mas kailangan ng nag-review na ethics board sa mga protocols natin sa sensory evaluation para masabi na walang na-violate na human rights. Okay, and then there's also the use of incentives. Some people give money, some people give small tokens as incentives. Generally, ang rule of thumb dito is the incentive should be commensurate to the effort required of them, but not too big na they will give they will be inclined to give positive responses to your product dahil may malaki kang ibibigay, no? Halimbawa, for a 5-minute evaluation, hindi naman 1,000 piso yung ibibigay mo kasi baka mamaya kahit basura yung product na pinatikim mo, sabihin nila masarap kasi uy, baka ano, mas malaking ibigay sa akin kapag sabihin kong masarap yung produkto nila. So on. So when you're dealing with panelists, you're also dealing with the samples that you serve to these panelists, no? And usually we have to standardize this to minimize biases and errors. So we'll discuss that later sa isang mga modules natin. Then we also have to look at the safety because the last thing we want is a sample that is served tapos nag-cause siya ng, let's say, pagtatae or na may na-hospital after eating your samples, lalo na kung mga bata ito, minors. And we also usually remove the effect of the packaging in our sensory evaluation, no? Kasi minsan yung packaging may effect yun sa psychology nila unless it's the packaging itself that you're studying. So there are interactions here and this is not really puro hard science lang. So we have to understand how the persons react to how your samples are presented as well. So as we looked at earlier, yung maraming mga applications tayong nilista and most of these have social dimensions as well. So since the products are available publicly dahil binebenta mo ito, and then there's a food safety aspect, whether it be yung perception ng mga tao as it being safe or the actual production of the food. And then there's the aspect of yung product development mo would require in the whole process continuous interaction with various humans, especially the end users, no? Usually, pag nagde-develop ka, sige, ito si formulation 1, 2, 3, first iteration, patikim ko nga sa kanila. Tapos may feedback. Okay, based on the feedback, I will change something. And then, patikim ko ulit. May feedback ulit. Hanggang sa okay na to, thumbs up na, mataas na yung acceptability niya. And then, of course, when you're dealing with taste genetics, then you're looking at the society and stratifying it into things like biological sex or maybe yun nga yung ethnicity ng tao, so on. So proven naman yan that ethnicities play a role in the distribution of taste genetics. So for the economic dimensions, as I mentioned earlier, we look at the demographics of the panelists and their purchasing power. Kasi as a marketing thing nga, we like to know what each social strata buys. No, there's room for buyers of bingo, corned beef, and those same buyers will not likely buy Delimondo unless they have Christmas bonus. And the other way around, yung bumibili ng Delimondo, wala naman silang dahilan bumili ng bingo. Okay? And then as with incentives, again, you don't want it too small na parang nilugi mo naman yung tao na pinaupo mo sila with you for an interview discussion taking 3 hours tapos ang binigay mo lang sa kanila ay isang pirasong mamon. No, at the same time, you don't want to give 1,000 pesos to the person who spent 5 minutes evaluating a single sample of, let's say, hot dog. Okay? So the rule is that it should be more or less commensurate to the task you will be giving them. Okay, and then for the samples, usually we have to strike a balance between the amount or volume of amount of samples. Let's say, depende kasi yan sa gaano karami yung tanong mo tungkol sa product, and then you would want to keep product waste to a minimum no, no sa US kasi halimbawa talagang pag ang sensory mo cupcake, they will give you three big cupcakes and then kakagatan mo lang isa-isa tapos anong nangyayari dun sa natira, itatapon mo na lang kasi bawal ilabas sa room. Okay? On the other hand, the volume of samples refers to how many samples you can give on a single sitting, no? So, kasi syempre, na-try ko na noon yung classmate ko, nagpa-sensory siya ng ice cream na gawa sa kalabasa and she gave me, I think, 9 samples at the same time. So, and then asked me to rank them. So, imposible yun, no? Mag-rank ka ng 9 samples ng ice cream pa, yung dila mo, sawang-sawa na sa texture ng ice cream and then you can't possibly remember whether this sample is the first or the third or the seventh, di ba? Unless yung first mo and last sobrang magkalayo na alam mo sila yung first and last. So pagdating naman sa industry, if you're hired as a food technologist, usually sensory evaluation is a tool used to redevelop a product for economic reasons. Now, first is changes in ingredients and or the process line. So, minsan ito ay simply, kailangan natin ng cost-cutting measures para hindi tumaas yung presyo ng produkto natin. So, can we change this brand of cocoa powder to someone na mas murang ino-offer sa atin and not affect the product quality? Can we reduce the amount of sugar by a few percent and hindi mapansin ng mga bata na hindi na kasing tamis yung produkto? Okay? Or we're changing equipment kasi i-retire na natin yung lumang process line, we're transferring to a new factory. Will the new product be the same as the old one? Okay. For example, you also want to develop products from indigenous raw materials. So, ingredient replacement na naman ito. Kung gusto mong malaman kung kapag nagpalit ka ba ng starch halimbawa from potato to cassava starch, parang ganun. May magiging effect ba siya sa product mo? And then usually we do quality control methods to prevent complaints. So whether it be the establishing of shelf life or to look at whether the complaints are valid, you can also use sensory evaluation to compare, let's say, your standard product to the product in question. So sensory evaluation, by the mere fact that it's dealing with different sorts of food, have a cultural and religious dimension. So alam naman natin, for example, na may mga relihiyon na bawal sa baboy o sa baka, or they have their food prepared in certain ways, like let's say halal and kosher. And siyempre for Islamic countries or Islamic parts of our country, these are relevant, no? And bahagi dito yung kailangan marunong ka na maghanda ng halal and kosher kung mapunta ka sa isang company na ganun yung kinikater mong products or yung research mo would deal with people from these religious backgrounds that have restrictions. So this also means that you need to be aware of your ingredient declaration, as they may contain ingredients that may be religiously offensive to certain individuals. So for the Muslim population, yun nga, pag sinabi nating halal, maaari nilang kainin nang hindi sila nagkakasala sa tenets ng kanilang relihiyon, while haram or forbidden includes those that are not allowed, such as pork and alcohol and byproducts or derivatives. Now, the problem we have with halal, of course, is hindi siya global standard. Even though they ascribe to one religion, Islam, worldwide, magkakaiba yung definition nila ng halal. Okay, may mga practices na mas strict sa ibang bansa, mas maluwag sa iba. Kailangan nating aralin yon kung magdi-deal tayo with these people. And so that's the reason why, for example, if you look at our fast food chains na may branches sa Southern Mindanao, medyo iba yung mga menu nila. Tinanggal yung mga pork items or yung mga pork dun sa ibang items. Yung kosher, wala naman masyado sa Pilipinas, but if nasa US ka, maybe Israel, no? So baka kailangan mo yun. So for kosher, marami silang standards dito, but meat items contain only products from kosher animals which are slaughtered to specific requirements. Actually, even in halal na may ganito na magpapadadasalan pa sa imam ah, yung hayop, and then kailangan yung method ng pagpatay sa kanya, may sinusunod na procedure like a knife to saan mo siya gigitlaan sa katawan, parang ganun, or papaano. So this means, of course, that when we're developing a product line, we must be sensitive, especially if our market would demand certain religious restrictions, no? Whether it be yung simple na bawal kumain ng dinuguan, yung ibang relihiyon, or bawal sa baboy at all, or they have to prepare a certain way, then we have to adjust because the commissary is producing our food. Then either you need to have two lines na ito yung pang Southern Mindanao, ito yung formulation ko ng palabok ko, walang chicharon, walang baboy, halimbawa, or gagawin mo na lang yung product mo na nationwide, di isa lang yung pag-produce, tapos wala talaga sila ng mga um, haram ingredients or non-halal, non-kosher ways of slaughter. And well, that is the reason why usually sa mga restaurant na wide yung scope like nationwide, medyo iniiwasan yung mga chicken and even sometimes beef products, no, lalo na sa mga Hindu. And that is why chicken ang pinaka-universal. Si KFC talagang halos wala kang problema dyan. Except siguro kung vegan yung ano mo, yung clientele mo, no? Magsalad na lang sila.